that the Congress is the most unpopular in Latin America in Peru. And so, are we just going live now?
Yeah, I forgot to hit the button. I'm sorry.
Let's start from the beginning.
Hi.
Is this show going to be live or is it going to be recorded?
It's going to be recorded and live.
Okay, it's both, right? But it's okay. I'll start from the beginning. But go ahead, ask your question.
Let me start over again. I don't know. I hit the button and I thought I hit it again, but
it's fine. We didn't lose much time, so it's fine. But if you can ask the question that you asked me initially to help jog my memory.
All right, let me just start over again with an intro, and then I'll edit it.
Sure.
That was technical error, my mistake. Hi, this is the Leon Trotsky News, the Leon Trotsky Revolutionary Newsletter and Podcast. I'm Connor Exum, and I'm with Alex Suarez, a Peruvian-American activist, author, and we're here to discuss the troubles in Latin America with the Peru incident that's taking shape right now and the Alex Saab case in Miami. Here's Alex.
Yeah, so yesterday there was a parliamentary coup of sorts against the Peruvian president, Pedro Castillo. And ever since day one, a year and a half ago, when Pedro Castillo was sworn in, the predominantly right-wing oligarchs in the Peruvian Congress have been plotting to oust him, trying to pass impeachments against him. They have not been looking out for the common people of Peru. Now, Pedro Castillo represents the common, mostly indigenous population of Peru. He's from Cajamarca. He's a school teacher of the working class, former union leader. And so he's not part of the establishment. He's incorruptible. There's been several heads of state of Peru that have faced jail sentences for corruption. And this upset the white elite U.S.-backed oligarchs in Lima. And so that's why they have been plotting against him from day one. And actually, the move that the reactionary result of yesterday we saw, the coup that Pedro Castillo made, was within the framework of the Peruvian Constitution. If you look at Article 134, during a crisis or emergency situation, the Peruvian president can dissolve Congress temporarily and call for a new election, which is exactly what he was trying to do. Although the right-wingers in the Congress, who are among the most unpopular throughout Latin America, knew they were going to lose and lose big. Therefore, they implemented their plans using a plant or infiltrator within the Peru Libre Party or Free Peru Party, which is the party of Pedro Castillo, with a woman by the name of Dina Boluarte. Now, Dina Boluarte was ousted from the party. She's one of Pedro Castillo's former vice presidents. A few months ago, she was ousted from the party altogether when Vladimir Cerrón, who's an important ally of Castillo and minister in his government, had called her out on Twitter as a traitor and divisive figure in the party. And so the U.S. is already supporting this coup, who is fully backing her from behind the scenes, implemented their plan in cahoots with the Peruvian right-wing oligarchs in the Congress in order to stage this parliamentary coup. And we saw recently in Argentina with lawfare, which is a combination of the word warfare and the law. It's a persecution under the guise of legalities used against Cristina Fernandez, the vice president of Argentina. And that was the day before the coup. That was 2 days ago. So we see the correlation between the U.S.-backed push against Cristina in Argentina and the U.S.-backed push in favor of Dina Boluarte becoming the dictator of Peru. But she's just as much a president of Peru as Guaido is in Venezuela. And we also saw something similar with Lenin Moreno in Ecuador. So Lenin Moreno, he's the one responsible for grabbing Assange out of getting the British to grab Assange out of his embassy in London, by the way. But Lenin Moreno, who called himself a centrist, infiltrated the party, the Socialist Party of Correa, the former president of Ecuador. So once Correa stepped down and Moreno took over, Correa went to Europe to visit family, and then he was not permitted to return to his country because suddenly they made an arrest warrant against him, and they threw Jorge Glass, who was the vice president, the leftist vice president, because there was a couple of vice presidents Correa had. So his leftist vice president, who was the vice president of Lenin Moreno, Jorge Glass, was arrested. Again, using lawfare, like they've used against diplomats. And so this type of lawfare and this supposed claim of violation of the Peruvian Constitution is the excuse that they're using now to have deposed or ousted Pedro Castillo. And that is a setback for the indigenous people. It's a setback for the plurinational nation. This flag here represents the nations such as the Aymara and the Inca indigenous people, or the Quechua from Bolivia, from Peru, Pedro Castillo, before he was known, was meeting with Evo Morales. They had a coup in Bolivia when that flag was given to me by Bolivian exiles.
Wow.
And they were burning the Wimpala, or plurinational flag, at that time in Bolivia. The white oligarchs in Peru are now burning that flag as well. And we need to push back against that. So in the context of the more indigenous, working class, and pro-poor socialist program of Pedro Castillo, we see this as a setback, although we see in other parts of Latin America the left rising up. Pedro Castillo, for example, even before Alberto Fernandez in Argentina, recognized Maduro. Soon after Venezuela late last year, Peru recognized the legitimate government of Venezuela. Therefore, the Lima Group, which was a bunch of oligarchs based out of Peru, were abolished because Peru itself, Chile, and other countries became left. Soon after Peru took the lead in restoring relations with Venezuela, so did Argentina. And now you see a potential unity. You see Lula coming into Brazil, which is a massive country as well. But you see the pushback at Cristina, as mentioned, and of course this coup against Pedro Castillo, which hopefully will be reversed.
But what are the grounds that they've started the coup with? Like
I said, they claim that he violated the Peruvian constitution, but if you actually look at the police report, it's very vague. Right now, he's still in jail. Last I heard, my context.
What I read was, and I'm not
because he was in with his right under Article 134 to temporarily absolve the Congress and make an election. Before he could even absolve them, they implemented the coup because they knew in the new election they were going to lose and lose big. The right wingers that were controlling the Peruvian Congress.
That's what I wondered. I wondered if their Congress was set up. I'm not an expert in Peru's, parliamentary process. If it's more like a vote of no confidence, like they have in England. Can the president call for that? I mean, even France can call for that because they have that hybrid presidential.
The dissolving Congress is kind of a shock word that they're using, but it was more like a no confidence vote for a new election. That's more what it was.
Okay, that's what I wanted to make sure because I wasn't clear on it myself, not being an expert.
When you say dissolve, it sounds like they're abolishing. No.
Yes.
People that were thrown out could very well be reelected and placed back into the Congress. The problem was they knew how unpopular they were with the Peruvian masses, mostly indigenous or mestizo, mixed with Spanish indigenous blood. So when these white oligarchs in the Peruvian Congress saw the potential for a new election, they got scared and they implemented their plans using Dina Boluarte to put her in power there and to do a coup against Pedro Castillo, the democratically elected leader.
Well, I mean, that's definitely problematic. And now, what do you think is the most important driving force? Because Peru's basically becoming a lithium and copper and, it's going to be the bread basket for those minerals across the entire planet.
The thing is, the United States wants access to Bolivian lithium. And they lost that opportunity when the Añez coup was reversed and everyone else was able to return to Bolivia. Right. However, there is an abundance of lithium still in Peru, copper, gold, silver, minerals, etc. And so, the United States wants a dictator in there to give cheap prices to the U.S. empire to benefit from that, much like the U.S. wants to exploit Venezuelan oil for cheap prices and pressure the Maduro's government in that regard as well. That's why they're using people like Alex Saab to try to pressure Maduro, but Alex Saab will not give in to the pressures of the tortures of the U.S. government. And so they're holding that diplomat on his trials coming up in Miami. I'm going to be going to soon. Hopefully he'll be freed because they just had a prisoner exchange with Russia in the United States. They have Fat Leonard down there, who's a very corrupt guy who bribed a lot of U.S. admirals in the Navy. And so he tried to escape to Venezuela. The Venezuelans have him. There's a lot of dirt he could give. The intelligent move would be to drop charges against Saab, and then maybe they can have some type of agreement where they could return Fat Leonard here to the United States. So these are things that need to be looked at. I mean, why do a deal with the Russians but not the Venezuelans? Because they're not white, right? I mean, a lot of this is racism. Look at Angela Merkel, for example. Angela Merkel, the former chancellor of Germany, she was elected 5 times. Did anybody call her a dictator? Number one, she's white. Number two, she has no oil. She actually depends on Russian oil at the time. So that's probably why, because you have so much oil reserves in Venezuela, and they don't have respect for people in the global south. So they call him a dictator just because the referendum decided he could be reelected multiple times. Not him, the people in a referendum. It's a very democratic system. I myself observed it last year when I went there as a companion or observer of their electoral process.
Really, you went with which group?
I actually didn't go with their particular group.
Okay.
I went there as an individual, invited and recognized as an independent journalist in the United States.
Oh, okay.
Invited by the Socialist Unity Party of Maduro in Venezuela. The only American resident in the state of Florida where Alex Saab's kidnapped that was able to go.
Wow,
that invitation. And so
that's quite
there was
nice.
other Americans that came in different organizations. There was from all over the world. There was 500 international observers in total, actually, many from Africa and Middle East. And so I was able to go there for the first time, being fluent in Spanish, using my connections down there over the years that I cultivated back from my time when I was a defender of the Venezuelan embassy in Washington from Guaido's forces, wrote a book about that. I've written a book about Alex Saab's case. That's been translated to a few languages.
That's impressive.
Excuse me. I love to return to Venezuela. But, it's not just about Venezuela. Now it's about Peru. And there's actively a fascist coup going on there. And I see in the context as an internationalist, Charlie talked a lot about international. In the context of internationalists, I see these as anti-imperialist nations that need to unite against the common enemy, which is the U.S. empire, where I stem from.
Do you think that some of the influence has to be because of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative that's taking hold in South America right now?
Well, you have to understand the Chinese relationship with South America in the context of BRICS, right? So for those that don't know, BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And now there's even talk of two other countries joining BRICS. One of them, Saudi Arabia.
And Iran.
Name of the other one.
Iran.
Oh, Iran? But that's not the one that I was told about. Hold on. Somebody just DM'd me about our new membership in the BRICS.
Iran is very close to it.
Let me just double check because I want to be accurate. Okay, this is the guy that told me about BRICS. Just scrolling up to his message. While I'm looking for the message, you can talk to the...
Yeah, well, I was just going to ask some questions about how you feel that this coup is being orchestrated, possibly by maybe the CIA. It seems that people are, that's the rumor I'm hearing.
Okay, it's Turkey.
Turkey? Is that the next one that's in it?
And I actually think as a condition for them joining BRICS, they would have to leave NATO and get closer to Russia. In many ways, with these sanctions against Erdogan and Turkey, they're pushing him into the arms of the Russians. Erdogan certainly has good relations with Venezuela. Many people, for example, that flew from the Middle East to Venezuela went through Turkey because they have airlines that fly into Caracas.
Yes.
I have a lot of issues with Erdogan. I'm not saying he's a good guy. I'm just saying in the context of the imperialist agenda, the United States, for whatever reason, considers him an enemy. And that's problematic because it's going to potentially have him leave NATO, get closer to the East, closer with Russia, and then even join BRICS. So part of the reason why the Saudis, for example, are not giving the U.S. a fairer price for gas, and the U.S. is now having to go to Venezuela and Iran, is because the Saudis are doing business now with Russia and talking about entering BRICS as well, which BRICS would function as a counterweight to the Western powers. Now, for me, the ideal would not be China and Russia dominating the world. For me, the ideal, and I'm talking economic domination, not military. And I'm a socialist. But for me, the ideal would be a economic domination of Latin America. And if Latin America gets their own currency, and you remember the euro currency is stronger than the dollar. If they get their own currency, unlike the euro, backed by natural resources they have in their own nations, that unity could have them become an economic powerhouse. And that's what the U.S. fears. And that's what the U.S. meddles all this time with coups and manipulations and pressures, economic coercive measures, such as sanctions, which are really a form of terrorism or warfare, which are even genocidal in some cases. This is what they do. People hear the word warfare and they think in a country, it's more than that. It's corrupting their judicial system to go after innocents. It's economic pressures. It's all of that.
So you want to see a independent Latin America from, the influences of Western Europe, not just America, but Western Europe.
Independent from all powers. So yes, they're having a counterbalance by doing more business with Russia and China. But I'd like to see Latin America itself dominate economically the world sphere.
Oh, really? But they're going to have to solve some serious problems. They got an inflation lock problem that they've had since the 60s, which has maintained a very low standard of living in a large portion of their countries. Now,
the black market is what causes a lot of the inflation. And a lot of the black markets are controlled by the right-wing opposition, not just in Venezuela. People talk about that in terms of the Venezuelan case. But you see in Peru and other parts of Latin America that these mafias, like not the Montesinos, the Fujimori mafia, used to be Montesinos. Montesinos was a minister in Fujimori's government that was pulling the strings. He got in trouble. Fujimori himself later got in trouble. He's a former Japanese-Peruvian president of Japanese origin. And so, you have the Fujimori mafia, who are the main rivals of Pedro Castillo. They're the far right. They're a combination of Japanese fascists and white, European descendant Peruvian elites. And so these mafias are have their tentacles in the black market, and it's very intentional in order to keep it and say, oh, you see, this president can't do their job. They're keeping the prices high on purpose to hurt their people. It's like they're saying, oh, look, they're starving their people, ignoring the fact that the strangulation, the economic strangulation, is coming from the U.S. government itself.
Well, I mean, I think there's some of it's coming from the U.S. government, but obviously there is a problem with the entire Latin America's trade system is upside down, and it's been that way for 2 centuries now. It's always been an extractive process for Latin America.
Well, for example, when the IMF comes in, the IMF has not been around for 200 years. It's been around
but I'm just saying, but from colonial period on, the IMF has just taken over the same position.
Well, yes, the U.S. imperialists have taken on the role of what the Spanish imperialists were doing. But let me give you an example of the IMF and the new governments in the early 2000s, how their interaction with the IMF had changed. So Argentina was in an extreme economic crisis when Cristina Fernandez's husband, Mr. Kirchner, took over. And so he was a progressive leader, and he reached a deal with Hugo Chavez at the time. So in exchange for Venezuela paying off the IMF debt in full that Argentina had with IMF, they would give Argentine cattle, which are known for very good meat, over to Venezuela. So they reached a deal that basically got the IMF out of Argentina. Now, later with Macri, he brought back the IMF loans, and Cristina and Alberto Fernandez are having to deal with that as well. Just so there's no confusion, Fernandez is a pretty common surname in Latin America.
Yeah.
Alberto Fernandez is not related to Cristina Fernandez. And also the women tend to, because they're more feminist than the United States and in Anglo countries, so the women tend to keep their maiden name. So in the United States, Cristina would be Cristina Kirchner. But she's called Cristina Fernandez. Sometimes Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, because when you put the de, that doesn't come from her. Her father's was her father's last name. But Alberto Fernandez, for example, it's important to understand that he's a centrist.
Oh yes,
he's at best center left. Cristina is much more progressive. So he's not necessarily friendly with Venezuela, but after a lot of pressure from his own observers, I talked with a lot of them, Argentine observers that were in Venezuela. He finally relented and recognized Venezuela after Pedro Castillo, though. So Pedro Castillo, soon after he got to power, recognized Venezuela. They've recognized them as well. They're no longer recognizing Guaido, and all of this symbolizes unity against U.S. imperialism, unity of the left in those countries. There are populist leftist governments that are democratically elected, but again, you see a pushback from these elites, like what happened in Peru. So,
right. But what I was and that's all very important. But what I was getting at is that what we need to see is a real buildup of indigenous manufacturing, indigenous programs that really put more of that population to work in really good jobs. That isn't extractive, So, like, say for example, you might build American engines down in Argentina and Brazil, but all the profits get sucked up and go to a North American company. What they need to do is have their own car industry that is local, that keeps the circular path of money from the car builders to the workers back into the economy and through the government and back around in a closed system, instead of this open system where the West has been extracting from them for the last 200 years.
I'll give you an example. There's a difference between Rafael Correa, who I mentioned earlier, and Evo Morales, who I mentioned as well. What Correa did when he was president of Ecuador is he would go to the multinationals and he would say no more. You do not take 80% of the profits and leave us 20%. You give us 80% of the profits and you keep 20%, or you're out of my country. And it worked. But Evo Morales went further. No, Evo Morales went further. What what Evo Morales did actually was nationalize a lot of those companies. But
Well,
that's
yeah.
you're seeing a different interaction with
That's very important.
Companies in those nations.
I mean, but Bolivia also had a very vibrant economy in the late 50s that was destroyed.
There was a revolution in the 1950s. It was later betrayed, and that's why Che went down there. But yes, they did have a revolution in the 50s in Bolivia that was pro-worker. It just didn't last very long because the military came back to power soon after.
But this was before that, where they were producing a lot of material goods for Western Europe and America, and because of the extractive process, the economy just slowly collapsed, and that's when you start to see that revolution.
By the 1960s, right, 10 years more or less after that revolution, Bolivia was the second poorest country in the hemisphere after Haiti.
That's right. And so what I'm saying is that there has to be that focus. Even if you do business with BRICS, you're going to have the same problems that you have with America if you don't actually focus on building up what it is that you need to support your own economy.
I described the rebellion in Bolivia in the 1950s as pro-workers, but it was not socialist.
No, it wasn't.
So the socialist movements that you saw emerge in the early 2000s were much more profound and lasting than what you saw in Bolivia.
Was it Bolivia or was it Paraguay that had the big water strikes in the late 1990s, early 2000s, when a German company wanted to own them?
Paraguay, in a war.
Well, they've been at war with Bolivia. I don't know.
Surrounding it, because it used to be much larger. It used to have the coast, like Argentina and Brazil is parts of that. But there was a war that Paraguay fought in, instigated by the West, unfortunately, by Europeans especially, because the United States was not as strong then. And Paraguay lost 90% of its male population. That's why when you go to Asunción, the capital of Paraguay, there's a woman with a child in one hand and a rifle in the other as their statue. That represents the Guarani indigenous woman who had to take up arms because the men were almost all killed off. And so those are the divisions you're talking about. Another great example of a European instigated division was the War of the Pacific, or La Guerra del Pacífico, which was principally of Chile versus Peru. But Bolivia was involved. Argentina was involved. Even Ecuador and Colombia at one point were involved. And Chile won the war. They eventually gave some land back to Peru, never gave land back to Bolivia for them to get their coast again. Because the Antofagasta region of now northern Chile has an abundance of minerals that the Europeans wanted to extract. So they instigated this war and gave weapons to Chile to be an aggressive party in the war against Peru. So you see those divisions, whether it's Paraguay, Peru, etc., in the past, which were all-out wars. Now things are done more clandestinely. It's done through the press, through character assassination, through lawfare, as mentioned, sanctions, and through coups. But you don't see American troops in Peru, do you? They're using their clients. They're using Dina Boluarte. They're using the right-wing Congress people in order to install a client regime.
Well, getting back to Dina Boluarte, how is she? What were her heterodox views inside the party that got her ousted finally?
From what I know of her, when she denied being of the ideology of the socialist leading Peru Libre Party,
okay, that would
she was declaring herself in much the same fashion that Lena Moreno was, a centrist.
Okay.
And again, Alberto Fernandez himself, the Argentine president, was also a centrist. But being a centrist in the left party can be problematic because they can be open to corruption, not necessarily bribes from Peruvian officials or Peruvian companies, but corruption by the U.S. Corruption not always also exchange of money. It could be bad influence by the U.S. that you feel entitled to take over a country and to try to reach better deals in the United States than the prior government that was the legitimate one.
Sure. Yes. Corruption takes many forms. But I was just curious because I didn't hear that she was kicked out ever, so I was kind of curious. And I'm sure plenty of people
trying to make her look like the active vice president of Pedro Castillo.
Yes.
She was fired a while ago. As a matter of fact, before she was thrown out of the party, he was no longer his vice president. He had like 2 or 3 vice presidents. She was like his first vice president last year. But there's some changes in his cabinet from pressure from the right and from the left. The pressure from the left is what got Dina ousted as vice president and later ousted from the party altogether after she made those remarks. So now they're using her to try to make it look legitimate, because at one point she was part of the party or the government of Pedro Castillo. But so was Lenin Moreno. He completely betrayed Correa. So that's why I'm calling her the feminine Peruvian version of Lenin Moreno.
I understood.
And also, she's like Guaido in the sense that Guaido's pretending to be president. I mean, to me, she might have some power. Guaido doesn't, but she's not a legitimate president.
Guaido only gets to be president in Miami.
Right. Well, you want me to get into the Miami case now? About
yes, that'd be great. Yes.
So that's going to be on Monday, the 12th of December, around the corner. I'm going to be going down there.
Next week.
Oscar Lopez Rivera will be there once again. He was in prison 10 years longer than Mandela, almost 40 years, released by Obama, former political. He was charged nothing violent, but he was a former, still is an independence fighter for Puerto Rico. And he's been advocating for Saab, and I'm going to be down there with Dan Kovalik and other comrades.
So what exactly is the case against Saab for people that don't know?
Yeah, let me give the chronology for those that don't know. So in June of 2020, during the Trump regime, Alex Saab was on a humanitarian diplomatic mission to Iran in order to acquire oil and humanitarian aid and other necessities that, because of the massive imposition of U.S. sanctions on the Venezuelan population, was necessary for him to find routes, alternative ways to fight that, to defy those sanctions. And therefore, they wanted to make an example out of him. They knew about him. He had roots in the Middle East, and so he was born in Colombia, by the way, but he has Venezuelan nationality. He's been in Venezuela for a long time. And so he became a diplomat in 2018 when the United States still had relations with Venezuela. It's important to understand legally. But when he went in 2020, he was not going to the United States. He was going to Iran. He had to make a stopover to fill gas up on his plane in Cape Verde Island off the coast of Africa. Now, when he got to Cape Verde, that's when the authorities, at the behest of the Trump regime, not only captured him completely legally, knowing he was a diplomat, but started to bring in U.S. agents, English-speaking agents. This is in Alex Saab's book, in his own writing, that I have a copy of, that I use portions of for my own book, The Diplomat, that I mentioned earlier. But he had American agents come into his cell and physically and psychologically torture him, knock his teeth out.
Wow.
Deny him his cancer medication, his stomach cancer medication. He was in remission, but the cancer could very well return. Even to this day, more than 2 years later, I still don't know if the Miami authorities gave him his cancer medication. But I do know when I saw him, he lost a lot of weight from what he used to look like. Gray hair. He's only 50 years old.
Wow.
Tragic. Separated from his family. I met his wife when I was down there.
A lot of stress.
For a year and a half in Cape Verde. Here comes in the Biden regime. And what do? In the middle of the negotiations in Mexico between the Venezuelan opposition and the legitimate government of Maduro, Alex Saab is kidnapped a second time, taken from Cape Verde on Biden's orders, and brought on one trumped-up federal charge to Miami. The other 6 were dropped because there's no evidence. So the only charge against Alex Saab currently is not for money laundering; it's for conspiring to money launder, based on without any evidence. Again, and so. He was brought there. I went to his hearing last year and early this year. They had a couple of hearings. I was there for that. I drove down to Miami. I live in northern part of the state. And so now is the trial to determine his diplomatic status. They could very well release him. There was a prisoner exchange recently between Russia and the United States. So there could be an exchange between Fat Leonard, who bribed a number of U.S. admirals in the Navy. I think I mentioned this earlier.
Yes.
They could drop the charges and then return Fat Leonard to the United States. We don't know, but I will be in Miami for that to see what happens. But basically, they're trying to make an example out of Alex Saab for defying U.S. sanctions. And they have no respect for diplomatic immunity, just as they had no respect for the other part of the Vienna Convention when it comes to embassies being inviolable. I was a protector of the Venezuelan embassy in Washington, D.C. The United States had invaded that a couple of years ago. That was during the Trump regime. The Biden regime, we see no respect for international law either. The United States is not a signatory of the ICC.
No, they're not.
National law, but it doesn't practice. And so we see these unprecedented moves, and it's very concerning for international affairs. If anybody has a question, by the way, let me know. Like maybe they'll put something on the chat or something.
I'm looking for that. I'm not seeing any.
We had to reschedule last moment too, so there might be not a lot of listeners live. So
it's okay. What I was going to say is that I'm not seeing any reasoning why they can even hold him for money laundering. He's not a citizen of the U.S. He's not. He's not laundering money, presumably for U.S. corporations. This was all going to be money from Venezuela corporations.
Defying U.S. sanctions.
Right, defying U.S. sanctions,
The
but
nice way to defy the coercive illegal measures, according to the UN of the United States, they're conspiring in some way to money launder, to have money to help their people. That's basically what's being told. Oh, yeah, it's also important to understand that the justification for grabbing him is that he's not a real diplomat because we don't recognize Maduro. Well, but Biden's starting to negotiate with Maduro, right? He's not negotiating with Guaido. And not only that, he's been a diplomat since 2018.
Mm-hmm.
Chronology doesn't make sense because in 2018, the United States still had diplomatic relations with Venezuela.
No, it doesn't. No, so I'm just trying to figure out and trying to parse out for the audience that, what exactly is what exactly is the complaint against him. I mean, because it's hard to put this money laundering, in my mind at least, get my mind wrapped around it, because essentially this is a foreign country. They're going to try to avoid your sanctions. I mean, that's how it works.
One of the claims is that Alex Saab stole from the Venezuelan people.
Oh.
There was a gentleman that gave a speech in Venezuela that I witnessed that said something very eloquently. And he said that if Alex Saab really stole from the Venezuelan people, he would be given an award at the White House, because that's all the United States has done to us with these sanctions, to steal from us. It's the opposite. And they're trying to claim that he collaborated. If Alex Saab collaborated, he'd be in a mansion right now. He wouldn't be in a prison. They've treated other collaborators in Venezuela very well. They wouldn't have tortured him. So all this is a means to try to discredit him. For those that believe that he's collaborated, you have to believe there's still WMDs in Iraq then. It's a fairy tale that are being told to us by agencies that have constantly lied to us.
True. But what I was getting at is that, I just don't see any legal grounds internationally. All of these crimes are against Venezuela, and the U.S. is one thing it's not Venezuela. So, I don't understand how this even passes any test of being, legitimate.
By the way, if there is a jury trial that proceeds after the 12th, it's Miami. Okay? What happened to the Cuban Five, right? One of the Cuban Five was born in the United States.
Yeah.
So they called them these foreign terrorists, and of course they had a bunch of right-wing exiles in the trial, in the jury, and they decided what they decided. So I think it's intentional, because they could have brought them to Washington, they could have brought them to other parts of the country. They brought them to Miami because they wanted to taint this.
Well, they got Cubans. Cubans are definitely anti-socialism, no matter where it is.
Especially the older generation one. The newer generation one, they're becoming more and more progressive. I have to say that I lived in Miami and I know them. But usually the older ones the old guard tend to be very right-wing and very racist against other Latinos. They look down at Mexicans. They don't mind Trump deports Mexicans because they see themselves superior to them. And they actually look down on other Cubans that are darker skinned as well, that are more indigenous, maybe Taino, maybe black. So those types of white, oligarchic.
Well, these are all the Baptists.
Are a lot of exiles and others that come to South Florida as well.
But the one good thing is that Venezuela now does have a large portion of Venezuelan people. Unfortunately, they happen to be, the ones that were run out by Maduro, that left because they couldn't, take the country back.
Well, a lot of them were not run out by Maduro. They left.
I don't mean they were physically run out by him on purpose.
That's true, though, that he's gone after criminals.
They were right wingers that left.
That might still have sympathies for Maduro. Don't want to admit it. They want to get lynched. But you have people that have gone to Peru, to the United States, and other countries that are Venezuelan for economic reasons. But they're not. A lot of them realize the primary reason, and there's mistakes been made by Maduro's government, like any government, but they understand that the primary reason has been the U.S. strangulation, the economic strangulation of the nation that has caused the joblessness and other problems that they're fighting back against. They're starting to rebuild, starting to get help from Russia, China, and others in order to fight that. Because I went to their factories and I saw that they're starting to rebuild as well. So
that's very important. They have to rebuild that economic base, otherwise they won't be able to grow again. And they
have trading partners. Brazil would be a great trading partner with Venezuela next year, because Bolsonaro clearly had bad diplomatic relations with Venezuela. According to my view, Bolsonaro only did one good thing. And the reason why he did is because he had to show himself as a nationalist. I don't even think he was a real nationalist, just a fascist or proto-fascist. But the only good thing that I know of that Bolsonaro did good was when the United States called Brazil and said, "Can we use your land to invade Venezuela?" They said no, and they went to Colombia and did it there instead. They had a land invasion of U.S. mercenaries that were captured later. Some of them have been freed already. So,
yes, I
you know,
remember that.
he uses land to invade Venezuela. Other than that, he's done terrible things. He's opened up land for the ranchers in the Amazon, destroyed indigenous areas. That's the oxygen of the world. The lung of the world is what they call the Amazon. I've been to the Amazon when I was a teenager. And one of the things I remember about the Amazon when I was in Peru was coming out the plane and breathing the air. It's just pure oxygen. The jungle is so important to the world's atmosphere.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And that's another thing we've got a problem with right wingers in Brazil, cutting it down, burning it up, and turning it into coffee.
Very pro environment.
Mm-hmm.
And so odds are he's going to start protecting those areas again right away.
Yeah, but didn't he also have to take on this time a very right wing vice president?
I believe his vice president is a centrist, and that's part of the deal, you could say, that was broken. But the thing is, it's much more dangerous to have a president who's centrist than a vice president who's centrist.
Unless you get
knows what Correa did. That was wrong, right? Correa trusted the wrong guy. Correa should have suggested Glass become president, not Moreno. So Lula knows whenever he has to step down that his current vice president should not be the guy in there, maybe Dilma or somebody else, because you put a centrist in after that, they could sell it to the United States and be almost as bad as Bolsonaro.
Well, I was thinking that before that they might arrange your retirement. Have a little coup for themselves.
He has very little power. Odds of a VP doing a coup against the leader is little. I understand that Dina in Peru was the VP of Castillo, but that was only in the beginning. Mm-hmm. They were finding a random person, and they got her because they thought, okay, we have some justification because he used to be part of their party. But the people who know better, like me, that know the history, that know what happened in Ecuador, can say, okay, this is Lenin Moreno 2.0. We see what's going on here.
Obviously, yes. But what I was just getting at is that, I wouldn't want a centrist anywhere near me because he's probably vying for the job and already figuring out some way to get me impeached. And then
he could be center left too. I'd have to study more as vice president. Center left is not that bad.
No, but from what I read was that he was that the agreement was that he had a right wing parliament basically and a more right vice president. That's the only way he could win this time.
Lula's very intelligent. He has a long history of being involved in Brazilian politics. He's very principled. He was a union leader as well.
I'm not saying he's not, but I'm just saying that
experienced in Maduro and Castillo. He's an older guy.
That's true.
He's been involved for a long time, so I don't think he's going to permit any type of treasonous activities there. But we'll see.
I wasn't thinking of treasonous even at first. I was just thinking that he's just going to be limited. His hands are going to be tied, trying to appease these two very different groups in the country.
The president has a lot of power over in Latin America is foreign policy.
Well, that's true.
One of the first things he's going to do is restore relations with Venezuela and make a good trade deal with them to help their economy as well. That would be mutually beneficial.
Sure, it would be. I mean, they should have a block, a Latin block, but that's always been dissuaded against by the Americans and Western.
They almost had their own currency during the pink tide, but they didn't have enough governments that went left. Peru did not go left.
I know. I'm just saying.
The coup in Peru is reversed, and Lula is able to consolidate power again, and Argentina is stabilized, and the IMF loans are taken care of again. Those are all things that could happen next year, and then we might be able to see more progress there. I'm trying to be optimistic, realistic at the same time, based on history, but there could be a pushback against this. The people could rise. There's talk of a rebellion in Cajamarca and in the countryside and the places where Pedro has support. Those people could converge on Lima at the palace and demand his return. He could be freed and embolden his movement because he's being held right now for him to retake power and for there to be new elections. We shall see. People said Morales would never return to Bolivia again. People said he would die in Argentine exile. Didn't happen.
No, so it didn't happen.
Pessimistic about Latin America.
I'm not being pessimistic. I'm just saying that they have a long road to go right now.
Mm-hmm. There's obstacles.
Severe ones. And it depends on how much.
You have to be persistent in their goals.
Yes, you do. But you also have to have support. And that's the question. Do they have the support right now? And it seems that they do. Although I was surprised to see as many right-wingers come out for Bolsonaro after he lost in Brazil.
Yeah, but he himself recognized the defeat. So
I know he did, but I'm just saying.
Yep.
I was just saying that I was surprised to see that kind of support come out for him, given what has happened in Brazil over the last, what was he in for 5 years?
Well, it's ideological. He handled COVID bad. He handled the economy bad.
Mm-hmm.
Still want to blame the left, even when the left doesn't have power. So it's ideological, that the reason why they're staying behind him. It's a type of fanaticism, you could say. His type of fake populism, very similar to Trump as well.
It is. But that's very hard to defeat, that kind of ideological. You don't win those people over overnight to get them on your side and use their support. But luckily in Brazil, they have enough leftists to maybe counteract that.
And the people of color of Brazil tend to support Lula. For example, it's a country with 80% Afro-descendancy.
Yes, it is.
And Venezuela, 60% Afro-descendancy.
Mm-hmm.
And Chavez was of mixed origin himself. So, you can say identity politics is kind of used in a good way to be more Afro-indigenous, pro-working class, because class has a lot to do with race when it comes to the history of Latin America as well, and the legacy of Spanish colonialism and imperialism in the region.
That is a good question, exactly how race is going to play out. Hopefully it plays out in a positive way, uniting the people of color.
The Vice President of Colombia, she's Afro-Colombian.
I know she is Afro-Colombian.
Good job picking her.
Her name
is Francia, I believe. Francia. Yeah, she seems very progressive.
I'd have to think about her name, but you're probably right. But I was just getting at is that, because these other groups,
Spanish, yeah.
These other groups are really moving in hard, though. I mean, you're seeing an uprising of the right.
France. Looking up her name right now. Yeah, Francia Marquez. I don't think she's related to Gabriel Garcia Marquez, but that's another great Colombian there, the late writer.
That is.
Yeah, so her name means France Marquez, Francia.
It's an interesting name. You don't really think of anyone calling them after France. So what else are you seeing as troubling signs or positive signs even?
Well, the fact that Pedro went to Caracas, this is a positive thing, was very significant. There's even talk of him doing what Torrijos did in Panama back in the day before Noriega and shutting down the U.S. bases. So I'm very optimistic about Colombia. And actually, they say that the military might strike against Petro. That has not happened. And even the military generals who tend to be conservative, not necessarily fascist, but conservative in Peru, when they were consulted about doing a coup, they refused.
Well,
so they did the parliamentary route against Pedro Castillo.
Well, that's good to hear. I mean, that's very important to know that the generals are at least neutral, because wherever they swing tends to end the fight pretty quickly.
The politicization of the armed forces of Venezuela is very important. It's part of the reason why you have not seen a military coup against Maduro.
That's true. So we got those positives. What do you think are the biggest negatives that we're going to see in the next couple of months?
What I mentioned at the beginning, the setbacks in Argentina and in Peru, the demoralization effect. And it will be a struggle. I'm not saying Pedro Castillo will return overnight. That'd be great. That's what happened with Chavez, though. Remember, 2002, yes. They sent him to an island to shoot him on U.S. orders.
Yes.
He took his jewelry off. He was ready for the ultimate sacrifice. He said he was going to go down like Che. They got the firing squad ready. They loaded the guns. He was going to go die with dignity, and he stood up, and they brought a priest, for him to give confession because he's Catholic socialist. And just before the assassination, all of a sudden they got a call that the helicopter brigade was coming to rescue him because 1 million of his supporters showed up at the presidential palace. They were ready to tear to shreds the puppet regime that was installed. And so they came and they rescued him last moment. People don't realize how dramatic it was. He was seconds away from being shot. That's a fact. And then he returned. So the coup only lasted about 2 days. If you get those comrades from Cajamarca, from Arequipa, from all those different parts of Peru and the countryside, north to south, they all converge on the coast and the center in Lima and demand his return, we could see a reversal of this coup.
Very rapid. That's true. And that would remind us of what happened in Bangladesh this year. How
Focus more on Asia. Tell me about Bangladesh.
you don't know? Oh well, the economy went upside down. They had inflation rates that were out of control, and the people rose up. And within a day or 2 days, they took over the country. And now they have to have new elections.
That makes me think of Nepal and how the Nepalese took over the monarchs, the Nepali Maoists.
Yep.
Fascinating.
And that was just this summer.
Weekend because their prince went crazy and massacred the whole family because they wouldn't let him marry his Indian wife. And that's the absurdity of racism. It's like your whole religion, Nepali Buddhism, is based on an Indian.
Mm-hmm.
And because she wasn't Nepali, he couldn't marry her even though she was Buddhist.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not justifying the massacre, by the way. I'm just saying these people are crazy. And then he went nuts and massacred everybody but his uncle because his uncle didn't show that day. So his uncle became king. But because the monarchy in Nepal was so this I know this history, in Indonesia, it was a few years ago. Mm-hmm. So because they were so deteriorated, the monarchy, the Maoists took in that vacuum and did a movement and took over Nepal, which was more pro worker type government that was there.
Well, that's kind of what happened here in Bangladesh. They had a very strong, right wing government that was focused on Western investments, and when the supply chain started to break down and the inflation went up, they didn't have any supply support for the average person, and the result was that thousands and thousands of the average worker just rose up, went to the capital, took over the actual government buildings and even the presidential palace. And there's photos of them sitting in there eating popcorn and watching TV. And it was all over. And I can see that happening in Lima too.
Well, if you look at the Burmese government, well, they're called Myanmar now. Yeah. The former Burmese government and the Thai government, there's a clear contrast. And I think that's because Thailand was never occupied by another nation.
No.
It never had a history of colonialism like Burma. It was a kingdom under a different name, but it was never under foreign control.
Siam.
So the Muslim minority in Buddhist Thailand has always been treated with tolerance or even embrace of their culture. Mm-hmm. Now, the Burmese don't consider their Muslim population from Burma. They say they're all Bangladeshis and they want them out. They're putting them in camps. But again, Burma was under Portuguese and I believe British control at one time, mm-hmm. right?
Yes.
So I did a paper once on it for college because I was saying my conclusion was the reason why the Thai government is so much more tolerant of that population because they don't have a history of division through colonialism. Because what does colonialism do? It divides, such as the Paraguayan case mentioned earlier, the Chilean Peruvian case mentioned earlier as well.
That's very true. But I mean, there's also other pressures inside. Thai has always had a better external relationships with other countries, trade-wise. Burma has always been used as a type of extraction process, which definitely destroys any type of cohesion within the society.
How long is your show usually, anyways?
Oh, whatever we want it to be. If you, I thought you wanted about an hour.
Well, we did. You talked the first 5 minutes, didn't go live, but I said in the first 5 minutes. Anyway, so I've been doing interviews lately, but I got to go get something to eat. So great talking to you, comrade.
Oh, it's great talking to you too. Thanks.
Could I tell people how to find me on my book, maybe?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So the book's called The Diplomat, but it's not under Alex Suarez. You see here the @ that's my Twitter name. So it's under Al R. Suarez. So R is the middle initial without a period. Al R. Suarez is my writer's name. You can find my latest book on there on the Alex Saab case. And I'll be updating people on Twitter how the trial goes in a few days. And you can find me on Twitter under Al R. Suarez as well with the number 2. And part of the title on Twitter is Alex Suarez because my name's Alex as well. So free Alex Saab, free Pedro Castillo, still being held in the Peruvian dungeon. And let's continue to fight against imperialism and advocate for a better society. Sounds great. I'm glad to have you on the show today. Hopefully we can have you back sometime soon. And that ends our show.